When Allied troops liberated towns and cities across Nazi-occupied Europe, they raised flags, embraced freedom, and uncovered an unexpected wave of vengeance. In places like France, Norway, and the Netherlands, women were dragged into the streets by their neighbors, their heads shaved, their dignity stripped. They were paraded through town squares, spit on, beaten, sometimes half naked. Their crime? They had once loved or been seen with, or simply survived alongside German soldiers. These women, tens of thousands of them, were accused of what came to be known as horizontal collaboration. Welcome back to the History Unraveled channel, where we bring the forgotten and complex corners of history into the light. If this story moves you or sparks curiosity, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode that dives deep into the truth behind the past. It didn't matter whether the relationship was consensual, coerced, or fabricated. The public judgment was swift and merciless. Around 20,000 French women were punished this way. In Norway, over 5,000 were detained without trial. In the Netherlands, Belgium, even on the small Channel Islands, no place was exempt. The mothers of children born from German fathers were targets. Their infants became living proof of a shame the communities wanted to erase. What unfolded in the summer of 1944 wasn't justice. It was spectacle. It was rage without reflection. Historians would later call it the ugly carnival. But for the women living through it, there was nothing theatrical. It was terror. It was betrayal. This story isn't about battlefields or political treaties. It's about what happens to a society desperate to reclaim power after trauma, and who they choose to blame in the process. To understand the punishment, we must first understand the world these women lived in. Between 1940 and 1944, life in occupied Europe was defined by fear, scarcity, and survival. Cities were bombed, food was rationed, and the rules of daily life were rewritten by foreign boots marching through local streets. In this bleak reality, the roles of women changed almost overnight. With millions of men taken away to fight or to prison camps, women became the backbone of society. They kept the families together, worked in fields and factories, and managed the home front. But in cities like Paris, Rotterdam, or Oslo, the daily threat of violence or starvation drove some into choices they never imagined making. And in many cases, those choices were not really choices at all. Take, for instance, the story of Claire Dubois, a 22-year-old from the outskirts of Lyon. Her father had been killed during the German invasion. Her brothers were missing in action. Left alone with her ill mother and two younger sisters, she took a cleaning job at a building requisitioned by German officers. One lieutenant, a Bavarian man named Karl, began offering her food and medicine. Later he proposed they live together. Claire never answered yes, but she never dared say no. Her story is echoed in thousands of other accounts from women across occupied Europe. Some did fall in love. Some were seduced, some were coerced. Others saw the relationship as transactional. Sex for food, safety, or shelter. But in the eyes of their neighbors, the reasons didn't matter. Sleeping with the enemy made you a traitor, regardless of circumstance. Across Europe, this phenomenon became so common that German soldiers even had a nickname for their local girlfriends, französische Freundinnen, Tysker Töse, Moffenmeiden. These relationships, often frowned upon by Nazi high command, were tolerated because they boosted morale. A smiling soldier with a girl on his arm in occupied Paris became a symbol of power and victory. For the woman, however, it was the beginning of a lifelong stigma. In Norway, records suggest that up to 50,000 women had relationships with German soldiers. In the Netherlands, that number reached into the tens of thousands. In France, it's estimated that 200,000 babies were born from these wartime liaisons. These figures reveal something deeper than betrayal. They reveal how deeply war infiltrates the private lives of civilians. The broader truth is that these women lived in a world where traditional morality no longer applied. When food is gone, the law disappears, and your family depends on you. Survival becomes the highest virtue. A loaf of bread from a German pantry could mean the difference between life and death for a child. And sometimes the price of that bread was everything else. But not all relationships were economic or emotional. In some towns, German soldiers were billeted in the homes of civilians. Single women, school teachers, widows, or daughters were forced to share space with enemy soldiers. Even without physical intimacy, the mere fact of proximity could mark them for shame. One Dutch woman later wrote, "I never touched him, but the neighbors whispered, and that was enough." It wasn't just adult women who were affected. Teenagers, sometimes as young as 14, were preyed upon by lonely, bored, or predatory soldiers. And in many villages, women had no protection, no recourse to law. The occupying authority was German. The local gendarmes were often powerless. If a woman said no and a soldier said yes, there was usually only one outcome. Complicating matters further, some women genuinely believed in the Nazi cause. They joined local fascist parties, attended rallies, wore swastikas on their jackets. But this was a tiny minority. The vast majority of so-called collaborators were just women trying to get through the war without starving. And the war spared little time for clarity. Lines between love and coercion blurred. Between survival and treason, there was only silence. And when the war ended, that silence broke open. Not in courts of law, but in the fury of the streets. By 1945, tens of thousands of women in France, Norway, and beyond had lived through 5 years of war, loss, and impossible choices. As liberation swept across Europe, many hoped for peace. Instead, what awaited them was public humiliation, shaved heads, fists, and spit. And in some cases, execution. In post-war Europe, no sin was considered greater than fraternizing with the enemy. Yet few paused to ask why it had happened. For a continent that had endured horror beyond measure, it was easier to punish women for intimacy than to confront deeper national traumas. Women became scapegoats for years of shame, occupation, and impotence, and long after the war ended, their scars remained. Claire, the woman from Lyon, never married. She lived with her mother until both passed away. Her story was recorded by a French historian in the 1980s. When asked if she regretted her wartime relationship, she said, "I regret that there was a war. I regret that I was left alone. But I don't regret surviving." This is the backdrop to the brutal scenes of post-war vengeance. These were not simply women who slept with the enemy. These were women abandoned by society, caught in the gears of war, and punished not for betrayal, but for enduring it. The punishment was swift, public, and brutal. For many women, the liberation of their towns was not a moment of relief. It was the beginning of their worst nightmare. Across France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium, women accused of consorting with the enemy were subjected to humiliations that bore the mark of medieval justice. And all of it played out in public squares, as crowds cheered, spat, and took pictures. France. Nowhere were the acts more symbolic and theatrical than in France. In cities like Chartres and Marseille, young women were dragged into the street by members of the French resistance. Their hair, often long, dark, and beautiful, was hacked away with dull scissors or razors. It wasn't just to humiliate them, it was to mark them. A woman without hair, with a swastika smeared on her forehead in red lipstick, was a walking symbol of disgrace. Witnesses described how women screamed, begged, or fell silent in shame. Some were stripped to the waist, paraded on carts, spat on by the crowd, and pelted with garbage. Children ran alongside the procession, jeering. Men with clenched fists stood proudly beside their victims, calling it justice. The French photographer Robert Capa captured one such moment, an unforgettable image of a shaved mother clutching her baby, her eyes hollow, surrounded by a furious crowd. The child's father was a German soldier. Norway. In Norway, women labeled Tiskertusser, German girls, were detained en masse. Some were forced into internment camps with almost no due process. The notorious Hovedøya camp near Oslo held hundreds of women in harsh conditions. There were no trials, no charges. Their crime was shame. Some lost their jobs. Others lost their homes. Many were ostracized from society, declared morally unfit. Their children, branded as German bastards, were bullied in schools and denied state benefits. A few women, humiliated and hopeless, took their own lives. The Netherlands. In Dutch towns like Maastricht and Groningen, women were publicly shamed in near-identical fashion to France. Shaving heads became a spectacle, an ugly carnival. But in some cases, the vigilante mobs escalated their violence. Women were forced to crawl through the streets while being whipped with belts. Some had tar poured on them before feathers were thrown, a throwback to medieval punishment. Others were forced to wear signs that read, "I betrayed my country." A local Dutch pastor wrote in his diary, "They punished these women not for what they did, but for what they represented, the occupation, the shame, the helplessness." Belgium and beyond. In Belgium, the pattern repeated. In small towns, women were seized, shorn, and shamed. In some cases, they were beaten unconscious. In one village near Liège, a young woman was stoned by her neighbors before being thrown into a river. She survived, but only just. The police looked the other way. In some German cities, women who had relationships with non-Aryan prisoners were similarly punished by Nazi authorities. Ironically, some of the same acts, head shaving, public shaming, that were later used against German collaborators in France, had also been used by the Nazi regime to punish women who fraternized outside the racial laws. Escalation and executions. Though rare, executions did occur. In rural areas of France and Yugoslavia, suspected female collaborators were shot by resistance groups. Often these killings were carried out without evidence, based on rumor, jealousy, or personal vendettas. Some women were executed alongside men who had truly aided the enemy, despite having no comparable role. In Paris, there were cases where women were mistaken for collaborators and attacked solely for having short hair, fashionable clothes, or speaking German. The chaos of liberation created fertile ground for mob justice. Public complicity and spectacle. What's perhaps most disturbing is the sheer popularity of these punishments. Crowds gathered by the hundreds. Children were brought by parents to watch. Some towns held mass head-shaving days, where dozens of women were lined up and processed like criminals. In one infamous instance, a loudspeaker announced each woman's name and her alleged crime before her punishment was administered. And yet, there were those who objected. Allied soldiers, particularly Americans and Britons, were often shocked. One British officer wrote, "We came to liberate them, but saw them doing this to their own. It felt like we were too late." A U.S. Army chaplain described witnessing a woman being paraded topless through a square. "I turned away," he wrote, "not because I pitied her, but because I couldn't recognize the people doing it as human anymore." The punishment of these women reached its peak in the summer of 1944, just as the war was beginning to turn in the Allies' favor. For many, these acts were less about justice and more about reclaiming lost pride. The enemy had left, but someone had to pay. The end of the war did not bring peace for the women accused of collaboration. For many, it was the beginning of a quieter, longer-lasting kind of punishment. The public humiliation, shaved heads, jeering crowds, spit and fists, was only the start of their suffering. In the years that followed, thousands of these women lived lives marked by isolation, mental anguish, and social rejection. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not understood or recognized at the time, especially in civilians. Yet countless women exhibited classic symptoms: depression, insomnia, emotional numbness, and withdrawal. Many never spoke about what had happened. Some never married. Others refused to look at themselves in mirrors. One woman in Belgium, interviewed anonymously decades later, said simply, "They took my face from me." In towns and cities across France and beyond, these women were shunned. Jobs disappeared. Friends turned away. Some priests refused funeral rites. Their names were scrubbed from public memory. Their existence quietly erased. The trauma extended to their children. Known cruelly as war babies, they too bore the consequences. In Norway, many were denied citizenship. In schools across Europe, they were bullied and mocked, reminders of a shame their mothers could never escape. Some were removed from their families and placed in state-run institutions where abuse was common. Governments have been slow to acknowledge these injustices. Norway formally apologized in 2018. Others remain silent. But in recent years, historians and activists have brought these stories back into the light. Documentaries, memoirs, and public archives have reframed these women not as traitors, but as survivors. Their experiences force us to expand our understanding of what war does to people, not just soldiers, but those caught in the crossfire of moral collapse and community vengeance. These women paid a lifelong price for surviving the only way they knew how. The punishment of women who fraternized with German soldiers remains one of the most morally ambiguous and emotionally charged legacies of World War II. Even today, more than 75 years after the last gun fell silent, historians, ethicists, and descendants continue to wrestle with what justice looked like and what it didn't. For many in the post-war years, the answer was simple. These women were traitors. Their relationships were seen as betrayals, not only of their country, but of their communities, their families, and the men who had died resisting the Nazis. To those who had suffered under occupation, the image of a woman smiling on the arm of a German officer was not just offensive, it was unforgivable. But hindsight has its own clarity. As records emerged, and as testimony from these women surfaced, a different picture began to form. Most of the women punished had no political allegiance to the Third Reich. Many were poor, many were mothers, most were simply trying to survive. And therein lies the moral tension that historians now confront. Was survival a betrayal? Was seeking food, shelter, or even companionship in the middle of war a punishable offense? Would any of us placed in the same desperate conditions have done differently? The question divides not just scholars, but nations. In Norway, the debate grew so intense that it culminated in a public apology in 2018, an admission that the country had failed thousands of women and children. France has yet to make such a gesture. In the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium, local debates continue to simmer quietly beneath the surface. There's also the matter of gender. As several historians have pointed out, male collaborators, those who worked in Nazi-run factories, served as informants, or even joined fascist militias, often escaped the kinds of public shame and violence inflicted on women. In many cases, they were prosecuted through formal legal systems. The women, by contrast, were punished in the streets. Their crime was not only seen as political, it was intimate, and thus more shameful. Some scholars argue that these punishments were a form of social cleansing, a way for communities to reclaim power and moral order after years of helplessness. Others see them as manifestations of deep-seated misogyny, violence disguised as virtue. There were exceptions. In a few towns, local leaders refused to allow public shaming. Clergy stepped in to stop mobs. Allied officers intervened. One American colonel in Normandy was reported to have said, "We didn't fight the Nazis to see this kind of justice practiced in the streets." But these were rare. Most often, silence prevailed. Governments looked the other way. Legal systems were overwhelmed. And the women, marked, shamed, and discarded, had no recourse. On social media today, the debate rages anew. History forums and Reddit threads teem with competing narratives. Some commenters cite the brutality of Nazi occupation and say the women should have known better. Others argue that war dismantles every normal rule, and to judge these women by peacetime standards is both hypocritical and cruel. In classrooms, too, the subject is now broached with more care. Instead of presenting a simple story of collaboration versus resistance, educators explore the complexity of human behavior under occupation. Students are asked to consider context, poverty, isolation, coercion, and the psychology of survival. These discussions don't always lead to consensus, and perhaps that's the point. The story of these women defies easy categorization. It resists black and white morality. It forces us to sit with discomfort, and to understand that sometimes the line between victim and perpetrator is not just thin, it's invisible. Their legacy is a mirror, reflecting not just the war, but the way we process memory, assign blame, and seek redemption. And in that reflection, we find a challenge to look deeper, ask harder questions, and speak for those who were silenced by history. The women punished after World War II for so-called collaboration were more than symbols of shame. They were survivors of trauma, abandonment, and injustice. For decades, their stories remained in the shadows, cast aside in favor of more comfortable narratives of resistance and triumph. These women were judged not through courts, but through the fury of neighbors and the shame of nations. Their punishment wasn't about law. It was about memory, pride, and pain. They became vessels for a society's unresolved grief. And yet, their stories endure. Today we remember them not to excuse or erase history, but to illuminate it. Their experiences force us to ask, what happens when war ends, but hatred remains? When survival itself becomes a sin? As we reflect on this painful chapter, we are reminded that justice, without empathy, becomes cruelty. That public humiliation, once masked as moral order, leaves scars that last generations. To honor the past, we must tell all of it. Not just the victories, but the wounds. Not just the heroes, but those who were never allowed to speak. These women deserve to be remembered not for their alleged betrayal, but for the silence they endured and the truth they now help us face.